Appropriate and proper behavior in front of a jury is an extremely important factor, although at times it can be difficult, as stress and emotional strain can significantly complicate the situation. However, as numerous examples and established court practice show, the best thing one can do in such a situation is to summon all their willpower and pull themselves together. Bill Mowbray was a resident of Brownsville, Texas, USA. At the time of the events described, in 1987, he was an exemplary family man, married to his wife Suzy. For each of the spouses, it was already their second marriage. From his first marriage, Bill had a daughter, Christine, who lived with her mother. When Bill met Suzy, she was also divorced and had 2 children, who from then on began to live with them. For 9 years, the couple tirelessly built their family happiness. They had a lot in common, including an age difference of only 4 years. Suzy had always been somewhat eccentric, but Bill considered her the epitome of a mother and wife. However, Bill was focused not only on his family and children but also on his career. After graduating from college, he began working in the field of car sales. Over the years of hard work, Bill managed to become a fairly well-known businessman. As of 1987, he had been running a successful Cadillac dealership called Bill Mowbray Motors in their city for 13 years. In this business, Bill enlisted the full support of his wife. She often visited him at work and starred in commercials that aired around the city. This allowed the family to earn a good income, so the Mowbrays were considered well-off and were local celebrities, often featured on television. They loved to travel, and in addition to a huge mansion in Brownsville, they managed to purchase 2 villas on the coast and several cars. Unfortunately, not everything was as cloudless as it might have seemed from the outside. In recent years, Bill's business had not been doing well. His dealership stopped developing, and over the course of a few years, Mowbray found himself mired in debt, as expenses began to exceed income. Up until the end, the couple managed to maintain the illusion of a prosperous life, continuing to spend considerable funds, but over time it became evident that they were facing a serious financial crisis. The worst part was that this crisis affected not only the Mowbrays' purchasing power. Even before 1987, the difficult situation began to have a detrimental effect on Bill's mental health. He developed a depressive state and repeatedly said that the only way out of this situation was to voluntarily end his life. For Suzy, this was a real shock, because her husband had never expressed such intentions before, let alone made attempts to take his own life. She was seriously concerned that Bill might do something foolish. Close relatives were also alarmed by such thoughts. Mowbray was even taken to see a psychotherapist, hoping it would help, but it did not have a significant effect. Bill himself repeatedly stated that they needed money, otherwise the family business would go under and they would find themselves on the brink of poverty. There was no way out of the financial crisis, and the man found himself in a hopeless situation facing the threat of bankruptcy. It seemed that only a new loan from the bank could remedy the situation. On September 15, 1987, 39-year-old Suzy and 43-year-old Bill called her son to wish him a happy 16th birthday. At that time, Suzy and her daughter were visiting her father. The conversation was pleasant, and nothing indicated trouble. Late in the evening, the couple watched a TV show and went to bed. However, around 2:15 a.m., the woman woke up and saw her husband lying on his side, aiming a gun at his head, holding it in his right hand. Suzy did not have time to react before a shot rang out. She called out to her husband in fright, but he did not respond, and blood quickly soaked the bedding. Coming to her senses, Suzy realized with horror that Bill was seriously injured. She immediately jumped out of bed and rushed to the home phone. But instead of dialing the emergency services number, for some reason the woman called Luke Froh, Bill's partner at work. She told him that her husband had shot himself and she didn't know what to do. Luke, of course, advised her to call 911 immediately, and Suzy did just that. However, precious minutes had already been lost. When the paramedics arrived at the call, they found the woman on the porch of the house. She was standing on the terrace with a cigarette in one hand and a glass of a drink in the other. Surprisingly, Suzy was not crying but behaving quite calmly. She led the medics into the house and pointed to the bedroom, but she didn't even go inside herself. Bill Mowbray was lying in bed, still alive but in critical condition. He was urgently hospitalized, but the man died in the hospital. The cause of death was obviously a gunshot wound to the head, and the gun itself was lying next to the body in a pool of blood. Initially, the main version of the investigation was Bill's voluntary departure from life, but law enforcement officers sought to thoroughly verify everything in order to close the case with confidence. Forensic experts began to examine the crime scene, where they had to deal with an excessive amount of blood. To establish an accurate picture of the events, a much more detailed examination was needed. Blood spatters were noticed almost everywhere, on most of the furniture, on the wall next to Bill's body, and even on the ceiling fan. Fortunately, the team of specialists included an expert in blood spatter analysis, who immediately set to work. According to his conclusion, the cause of Bill's death was a single shot to the head, with no signs of struggle or resistance. No fingerprints other than his own were found on the gun lying next to the businessman's body. From the very beginning of the investigation, Suzy consistently defended her version of events, insisting that Bill had long suffered from a depressive disorder, had suicidal tendencies, and had repeatedly talked about it. Her words were confirmed by most of the couple's close relatives and friends. According to their testimonies, the businessman had barely been keeping his head above water lately, running the dealership, which noticeably worsened his psychological state. However, Suzy's own behavior aroused considerable suspicion. She didn't look like a grief-stricken widow at all, talking about her husband's death as if it were some mundane thing. But even that didn't make the investigators look at her more closely. The most suspicious thing seemed to be the 12-hour time frame immediately after Bill's death. During this period, the dead man's brother Jim came to the Mowbray's house, wanting to talk to Suzy, support her, and see the scene of the incident with his own eyes to find out what had really happened. It's hard to imagine his surprise when he went upstairs and suddenly heard music and women's laughter coming from there. Soon the heroine of this story came out to Jim and casually informed him that she was having a party with her friends. Of course, Jim found such behavior extremely outrageous. Subsequently, he became one of Suzy's most ardent opponents, who tried with all her might to prove her innocence in her husband's death. It turned out that the women had managed to remove all the furniture and carpeting from the bedroom that was splattered with Bill's blood. The group of friends was not only having fun to music but also started repainting the bedroom walls a different color. Naturally, the police perceived such behavior as a blatant and brazen attempt to destroy evidence of the crime. Despite these seemingly desperate measures by Suzy to cover her tracks, experts were still able to reconstruct a complete picture of the event based on an analysis of the shape of the blood spatters. Now the version of Bill's suicide faded into the background, and the detectives became convinced that the fatal shot was fired by Suzy herself. Apart from the evidence collected on the first day, the investigators had no other leads, so they focused on the remains of the furniture and the nightgown worn by the victim's wife. After carefully analyzing these pieces of evidence, the experts came to the conclusion that Bill had become a victim of his own wife. Most likely, she had shot him in the head while the man was sleeping carelessly. The accusation came as a shock to Suzy, and she immediately hired a lawyer to defend her. The woman consistently defended the version of financial difficulties in the family, which supposedly drove her husband to suicide, and this line of defense found numerous confirmations during the investigation. Suzy claimed that the couple's unsuccessful trip to the bank for a loan was the last straw for Bill, and that was what pushed him to take the fatal step. The businessman's inner circle was aware of his difficult financial situation, but not everyone was inclined to consider his widow innocent. Detectives spoke with the bank employee Bill had approached shortly before his death. He said that during their meeting, the businessman was in an extremely depressed state, broke down in tears, and stated that he would take his own life if he did not get approval for a new loan. Unfortunately, Bill's financial affairs turned out to be so bad that his application for $200,000 had to be rejected. The credit expert was powerless to help and was forced to refuse. There were many witnesses to the desperate state and deep depression Mowbray was in during the last days of his life. Despite this, certain doubts about the role of his wife remained, and some interpreted her strange behavior as a kind of celebration on the occasion of her husband's death. Such rumors not only intensified the suspicions of the investigation but also caused condemnation from the general public. However, Suzy's lawyer continued to insist on her innocence. He claimed that when Bill last visited the bank, his goal was to get a loan to save his business and pay off debts that were already threatening him with bankruptcy at the time. Therefore, the refusal was a real blow to him. On that fateful evening, Bill returned home gloomy and aloof, hardly talking to anyone. Suzy barely managed to calm him down, but it didn't make things any easier. The man spent the last days of his life in a state of deep depression, desperately seeking a way out of a difficult financial situation, but it was all in vain. According to Suzy, it was after the bank's refusal that Bill began to talk more and more often about wanting to end his life. She tried to support him and even accompanied him to a psychotherapist, but it did not yield the desired result. At the same time, the lawyer was looking for any facts that could confirm the innocence of his client. And there were some successes. Among Bill's old friends, people were found who reported that 10 years before the tragedy, the man had already tried to take his own life. This happened back in the 1970s, before his marriage to Suzy, so no one told his wife about this incident. It seemed that after meeting Suzy, Bill's life had finally gotten back on track, and his loved ones calmed down, no longer worrying about him. However, this information only confirmed the fact that the main figure in the case had long had suicidal tendencies. Suzy's defender was convinced that this would become a weighty argument in favor of his client if the case went to trial. The lawyer also did not consider the party thrown by the woman in the house immediately after the tragedy as evidence of her involvement in her husband's murder. Moreover, he argued that all the evidence provided by the prosecution was indirect and would be easy to refute. In his opinion, the widow's strange behavior did not at all indicate that it was she who pulled the trigger. However, the victim's relatives, in particular his brother Jim, insisted that by her compromising actions, Suzy demonstrated complete indifference to Bill and demanded that his killer be held accountable. And the investigation's version that the businessman's death was not an accident had some grounds. In particular, the detectives were puzzled by the fact that Bill allegedly decided to end his life in the presence of his wife, who was sleeping carelessly beside him. Such behavior is not entirely typical of potential suicides, who usually prefer to die alone. Moreover, to carry out his intention, Mowbray would have had to act in one of two ways. The first is to keep a loaded gun by the bed or under the pillow, which, however, is not such a rare occurrence. The second is to wake up in the middle of the night, get up, take the weapon, and then return to bed to shoot himself. Suzy did not remember her husband getting up that fateful night, although she may simply not have noticed it through her sleep. Instead, the woman recalled that she had once held Bill's gun when she found it hidden under his pillow. The widow claimed that he always kept the weapon in the bedroom solely for self-defense. In fact, for Texas residents, this was considered a completely normal practice. However, the detectives naturally had a question as to why, then, no fingerprints of Suzy were found on the gun if, by her own admission, she had touched it. In response, the woman insisted that Bill regularly cleaned and lubricated the weapon, so he could have simply wiped it with a rag. But the investigators refused to believe this version. They carefully studied the Mowbray's marital relationship and found out that over the years of his second marriage, Bill had repeatedly cheated on his wife, which she was well aware of. Once, when Suzy's patience ran out, she even moved out with her children and settled in a hotel. But later, Bill persuaded her to return, and the family was reunited. However, there were rumors that marital relations never improved after this incident. Allegedly, the Mowbrays were planning a divorce and had even begun to divide their jointly acquired property. All this gave Suzy a strong motive to get rid of her annoying husband. But what caused the most suspicion in the investigation was the woman's behavior immediately after the shot when she woke up. After all, Suzy was well aware that Bill, although seriously wounded, was still alive. So why, instead of calling an ambulance and giving her husband a chance to be saved, did she decide to call his colleague? The heroine of this tangled story explained her strange act by the fact that she was confused and had a poor understanding of how to act in such a critical situation. So she just wanted to consult with an old friend of their family. By the way, at some stage of the investigation, there was even a suspicion that this Luke could have been an accomplice in the murder, but it was not confirmed. According to the man, when Suzy called him, there was not a hint of fear or despair in her voice. However, Luke turned out to be quite sensible and persistently advised the woman to immediately dial 911, the emergency services number. Which, after a short hesitation, she did. Examining the body and the scene, forensic experts noticed another extremely suspicious detail. It turned out that in addition to the fatal head wound, the deceased also had a gunshot wound to his left arm. At the same time, it was obvious that Bill had been shot with a gun clenched in his right hand. But here's the odd thing, no drop of blood was found on his right palm and fingers. Experienced experts knew well that during a shot at point-blank range, a whole bloody vortex of numerous tiny spatters inevitably forms. A few microscopic stains were found on Suzy's nightgown. So, logically, traces of blood should have remained on the shooter's hand as well. But Bill's right hand was found carefully hidden under a pillow, as if someone had deliberately made sure it was clean. Therefore, the likelihood that the man had actually committed suicide seemed minimal to the investigation. However, it was impossible to prove Suzy's guilt without a strong motive. As the detectives found out, the suspect did have one, of a purely mercenary nature. However, it was not about a banal desire to receive insurance after Bill's death, as the lives of both spouses were insured. But shortly before her husband's death, Suzy suddenly became interested for the first time in the details of his insurance policy, calling the company. And she found out that Bill had made several significant changes to the document beforehand. Firstly, he increased the amount of compensation to be paid to the beneficiary in the event of his death to almost $2 million. And secondly, he excluded his wife from the list of beneficiaries, designating his daughter from his first marriage, Christine, as the sole recipient of the money. Moreover, all these changes were to take effect literally a few days after Bill's death. Upon learning this, Suzy became enraged, and the investigation regarded her state as another motive to get rid of her hated husband with his financial problems as soon as possible in order to grab the money and pay off all debts. It is quite probable that Bill decided to exclude his wife from the list of beneficiaries because he no longer trusted her and had doubts about her fidelity. Instead, he sought to ensure a carefree future for his own daughter. But despite the logic of this version, several contradictory points immediately arose in the case. First, if Bill had really planned to end his life, he would almost certainly have waited until the changes to the insurance policy officially took effect. And for that, he would have had to be patient for just a few days. Moreover, the man was well versed in legal and financial nuances, so he should have known about the peculiarities of Texas legislation regarding suicide. Its essence was that insurance companies do not make any payments to beneficiaries if the insured person voluntarily ended their life earlier than 2 years after the policy was issued. That is, all of Bill's potential plans to secure his daughter's future in this way were doomed to fail from the start. Therefore, the detectives were inclined to think that the businessman did not actually intend to commit suicide. With his talk about suicide, he most likely just tried to play on the pity of others and manipulate them, in particular the bank employees, hoping to get the coveted loan. And in general, weighing all the illogicalities and oddities in this case, the investigators concluded that Bill was not going to take his own life and that he was helped to do so. Ultimately, based on a body of circumstantial evidence, Suzy was arrested and charged with the murder of her own husband. During the trial, the prosecution actively used one of the common methods of forensic science, the analysis of bloodstain patterns. This approach was first used to obtain evidence and substantiate charges back in the 1950s. Herbert MacDonald is considered the founder of the method. It was he who was involved in the trial of Suzy Mowbray as an expert, and his testimony played an important role. Interestingly, this principle of analysis, which for a long time was considered basic and indisputable and firmly rooted in the American justice system, was seriously criticized and questioned by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 2009. The reason for this was the fact that the correct and accurate application of the methodology required considerable experience and qualification of the expert, which was often lacking. By the way, it is known that much of the evidence in the Bill Mowbray murder case was analyzed by inexperienced professionals. However, this circumstance was not taken into account in the trial. Although the analysis of the shape of blood spatters has since been criticized, it still retains its value and is still actively used. However, now they try to involve only highly qualified forensic experts with solid experience in such examinations. In addition, at one time, doubts about the reliability of this method led to a review of a number of court verdicts. But at the time of the Suzy Mowbray case, Herbert MacDonald's approach was considered indisputable. Interestingly, the defendant's former father-in-law unexpectedly took her side. The man stated that even after the divorce, he maintained a warm relationship with his former daughter-in-law and never noticed any signs of aggression in her. Moreover, according to him, Suzy did not know how to handle weapons at all. Suzy was also supported by Luke Froh, a family friend and partner of the deceased Bill, whom the woman called immediately after the shot. He stated that he believed in the version of Mowbray's voluntary departure from life. According to Luke, because of problems with the car dealership, he himself was planning to quit, and Bill took this news very hard. In general, the businessman was in an extremely depressed state during the last days of his life and gave the impression of a very lonely person. But the prosecution did not give up and continued to insist on their version of events, using all possible means of influencing the jury. For greater persuasiveness, the prosecution even demonstrated the Mowbray couple's bed in the courtroom, on which they placed two mannequins in the form of Bill and Suzy. The victim's blood stains were still visible on the sheet. In this visual way, the prosecutor wanted to convey to the jury his vision of what had actually happened that fateful night. And although the defense made considerable efforts to convince the court of their client's innocence, the jury ultimately found Suzy Mowbray guilty of murdering her own husband. On June 9, 1988, the woman was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, despite the harsh sentence, the widow still had many supporters who sincerely believed in her innocence. Suzy was most supported by her biological son Wade and her daughter from her previous marriage. They made every effort to get the unfair, in their opinion, court decision overturned or reviewed. The children knew that until her last breath, their mother had supported Bill and could not have simply taken and shot him. While the woman was serving her sentence behind bars, Wade entered law school and devoted all his time to a thorough study of the materials of the criminal case. He meticulously analyzed all the evidence, looking for the slightest mistakes and procedural violations that investigators, prosecutors, and involved experts could have made. The young man desperately tried to find solid grounds for filing an appeal and worked closely with his mother's lawyers in this direction. Unfortunately, processing a huge array of information took a lot of time, because each fact had to be carefully verified and comprehended. But despite everything, Wade did not lose faith and was firmly convinced that he would be able to prove his mother's innocence and achieve justice. At that time, Suzy Mowbray had already spent 8 years behind bars. Finally, the defenders managed to prepare and file an appeal, which was drawn up so thoroughly that it did not seem possible to ignore it. The main emphasis in the document was placed on the analysis of blood spatters, which played a key role in the prosecution's tactics and became one of the decisive pieces of evidence against Suzy. But the defense voiced serious doubts about the proper qualifications of the forensic expert who conducted this examination. According to the specialist, more than 45 small drops of her husband's blood were found on the accused nightgown. Interestingly, it was in this key piece of evidence that the main weakness of the prosecution's position and a weighty reason for its refutation lay. Suzy's lawyers challenged the reliability of the results of the luminol test, pointing out that not only blood but also some other organic substances can cause fluorescence in ultraviolet light. In their opinion, the experts should have necessarily conducted an additional check specifically for the presence of blood, which was not done. But the worst thing was that at the time the appeal was filed, the nightgown itself had mysteriously disappeared from the evidence, and therefore lost any evidentiary value. After carefully analyzing the case materials, the court nevertheless accepted the appeal for consideration. Before the start of the new trial in 1998, all the evidence, except for the missing garment, was subjected to scrupulous verification once again. Meanwhile, the defense also thoroughly finalized their tactics and strategy. At the retrial, the defense finally voiced a version that could explain even the absence of blood traces on the weapon and Bill's shot hand. The lawyers suggested that the man could have shot himself while holding the gun under the pillow, and his left hand at the moment of the shot was on the opposite side of his head, where the bullet left the exit hole. The behavior of some experts during the new hearing seemed rather strange. In particular, the forensic medical examiner who had performed the autopsy on Mowbray's body at the time made one of the key statements. In his opinion, the evidence gathered was insufficient to state with absolute certainty that Suzy had killed her husband. However, in order not to completely disgrace himself, he still continued to insist that the businessman could not have shot himself without outside help. And since only Bill and his wife were in the house at the time of the tragedy, the expert believed that she should be considered the main suspect. Ultimately, Wade Mowbray's studies at the law school and his active cooperation with his mother's lawyers bore fruit. Thanks to the tireless efforts of the defenders, a kind of conspiracy in the ranks of the prosecution was revealed, which essentially deprived Suzy of one of the fundamental constitutional rights, the right to a fair trial. It turns out that during the investigation, the prosecution involved the renowned expert Herbert McDonnell in the case, who was to re-examine the suspect's nightgown and confirm the prosecution's version. But contrary to expectations, the scientist confidently refuted the arguments of the accusers. However, at the trial, for some reason, the prosecutors decided to keep silent about McDonnell's conclusions and did not transfer his examination to the defense at all, although the law obliged them to do so. Instead, they continued to use the nightgown as evidence against Suzy, which, of course, was a gross violation of her rights. Therefore, it is difficult to overestimate the role of Wade Mowbray in the difficult struggle for his mother's freedom. After all, it was he who was able to discern this crucial detail, which testified to outright lies and gross manipulations on the part of the prosecution. Now the defense only had to convince the jury of this. The so-called Brady Rule in American jurisprudence directly obliges prosecutors to transfer to the defense any significant information that could exonerate the defendant or mitigate their guilt. However, in the case of Suzy Mowbray, this norm was grossly ignored. Herbert McDonnell's conclusion did not even reach the lawyers. Finally, in January 1998, Suzy found herself in the courtroom again, where a retrial was to take place. Over the years spent behind bars, the once attractive woman had turned into a pale shadow of herself. But despite her emaciated face, hope for long-awaited freedom still shone in her eyes. As before, Suzy insisted on her complete innocence. Her friends who took part in that dubious party with the hasty renovation of the bedroom where the owner of the house was killed sided with the accused. They claimed that it was actually just another one of Suzy's eccentric antics. According to them, the woman simply wanted to get rid of the horrific bloodstains as soon as possible and did not even suspect that she would later be accused of deliberately destroying evidence. Moreover, one of the friends explained her participation in that performance by the fact that when they arrived, the house was not cordoned off with police tape, and they themselves were not warned that the inspection of the scene was not yet complete. Indeed, initially the investigators simply concluded that a voluntary departure from life had occurred in the Mowbray house. So they did not pay too much attention to the situation at the scene of the tragedy, striving to close the case as soon as possible and send the materials to the archive. So Suzy was indeed allowed to stay in the unfenced house. Another friend claimed that she only wanted to help Suzy, who did not want her children to see the blood-spattered room when they returned home. That is why the tipsy women decided to refresh the interior on the spur of the moment. Moreover, both sincerely believed in the innocence of the mistress of the house. At the retrial, the unqualified expert who had examined Suzy's nightgown at the time also testified. He admitted that his previous testimony did not really have a scientific basis. Even Herbert McDonnell was stunned by how that examination was conducted. According to him, instead of a thorough analysis, the would-be specialist simply tried to estimate the shape and location of the spatters by eye. What can we say when none of the experts even bothered to check whether the stains found on the nightgown were blood? All this data was extremely insufficient to draw any reasonable conclusions. In light of the new facts, the version of Suzy Mowbray's lawyers began to seem quite convincing to the jury. The defense focused on Bill's suicidal tendencies, and this time their arguments were supported by much more substantial evidence than the uncertain testimony of a few of the deceased's friends. The decisive factor in the lawyer's tactics was the businessman's extremely difficult financial situation. When the bank refused him another loan, Bill's company was on the verge of complete bankruptcy. The family was rapidly falling into a debt hole, so at some point the man may have had the idea to shoot himself. After all, by becoming a victim of an accident, he would at least ensure a carefree life for his daughter from his first marriage at the expense of substantial insurance payments. That is why in the last days of his life, Bill spent the rest of his savings to maximize the amount of compensation in favor of Christine. According to the defenders, the fact that the suicide occurred a few days before the changes in the policy took effect was explained by Bill's extremely unstable emotional state. It is quite possible that at some stage, severe depression or a sudden deterioration in his well-being did not allow the man to soberly assess all the legal nuances. At least this was indicated by the businessman's strange behavior in the last days before his death. Ultimately, the lawyers managed to sow reasonable doubts in the minds of the jurors regarding Suzy Mowbray's guilt. The defense team was confident that they had managed to tip the scales in favor of the defendant, so they eagerly awaited the closing arguments. But suddenly, during the prosecutor's closing speech, a strange metamorphosis happened to the accused. The 49-year-old woman seemed to completely lose control of herself. She wildly screamed that she had not killed her own husband and burst into tears. This emotional turnaround was unexpected. On the one hand, the jurors could feel sympathy and believe in the sincerity of these words and tears. But on the other hand, it could be interpreted as a sign of uncontrolled aggression, which would only worsen the situation. The jury deliberation on the verdict lasted 4 hours in tense anticipation. And although no specific conclusions were made about Suzy's actual guilt or innocence, on January 23, 1998, she was acquitted on all charges. However, the widow still had opponents convinced of her guilt, who focused on her behavior. Undoubtedly, the woman behaved strangely, but supporters, including her son and daughter, explained this by the stress and emotional tension caused by the situation. Opponents, however, insisted that even her outburst of anger in court was carefully planned. It was believed that the woman tried to finally convince the jurors of the miscarriage of justice regarding Suzy's conviction. However, the lawyer denied that this emotional outburst was planned. The defender, on the contrary, considered this move too risky for such a situation. They undoubtedly had enough convincing arguments. Such a move could have provoked a negative reaction from the jury. As already mentioned at the retrial, Suzy's nightgown was not presented as evidence. The prosecution team stated that the evidence was lost. This raised even more questions, because usually such physical evidence does not disappear without a trace. The prosecution's strategy came under severe criticism. Therefore, the controversial evidence could have simply been destroyed to avoid a new examination. The opinion of the respected Herbert MacDonald could have played against the prosecution, so without this evidence they still had a chance to fight. In the year of her 50th birthday, after being imprisoned in the winter, Suzy Mowbray was acquitted, which became the best birthday present for her, for which she thanked her son. Later, in 2001, she gave an interview. At that time, the unjustly convicted woman had already been free for 3.5 years. In total, she spent just under 10 years behind bars. As Suzy noted, now she just wanted her children to be proud of their mother. But not everyone was satisfied with this result. The prosecution, Bill's first wife, and his daughter Christine considered the verdict unfair. They were sure that Suzy had escaped punishment for murder. According to the first wife, after Bill's death, Suzy began to urgently sell things from his house in order to get at least some money. A real court battle for the husband's inheritance unfolded between the first and second wives. No one ever received a single dollar from Bill's life insurance amount. Suzy planned to write a book about her adventures, but since 2002, nothing has been heard about these plans. During this period, she went to court demanding the return of the insurance payment for her deceased husband. It is known that she lost this process. Her son Wade continued his law career but later moved away from this activity. The young man became a pastor and began to advise other clergy. It is worth noting that Suzy, who previously loved being the center of attention and participated in her husband's advertising campaign in the 1980s, completely disappeared from the screens after the failure of the appeal regarding the payment of insurance funds. Suzy Mowbray did not attend the last TV show in 2021 dedicated to this case. However, her lawyer was present there. He openly called it a tragedy that the businessman's widow spent so much time behind bars, which ruined her life. He always considered her innocent. Barbara Maliniks was born on May 29, 1950 in Munich, Germany. She spent her childhood in Germany, growing up in a family with slightly above-average income and not standing out in any particular way among her peers. At the age of 18, Barbara decided to get married, as she had always dreamed of having a family. However, the relationship was not ideal from the very beginning. The girl's fiery and audacious character did not match her husband's idea of the perfect wife. Constant quarrels led to a divorce a few years later. After that, Barbara decided to change her life and move to the USA. In total, Barbara had 3 marriages, and all of them ended in divorce. From her previous relationships, she had 2 sons who, at the time of the events described, were already living separately. Only her 17-year-old daughter Rachel, born in her marriage to her 3rd husband Bruce Maliniks, remained living with her mother. Bruce was 9 years younger than Barbara. Initially, the family lived in Oakland, Oklahoma, USA. Bruce was attracted to Barbara's vibrant personality, but over time these traits began to irritate him. The situation repeated itself, as in previous relationships, which eventually led to divorce. Rachel was born in 1989 and became a real princess for Barbara. According to the woman herself, she had always dreamed of having a daughter, so the girl was surrounded by care and attention from childhood. Rachel had the largest bedroom, was bought the best clothes, and had lavish birthday parties thrown for her. In her teens, she convinced her parents to transfer her to a private school with a flexible class schedule only once a week. Thus, the girl was not overstrained by studying, and her parents indulged her whims. Rachel led a carefree life, studied well, was engaged in sports, and participated in basketball competitions between schools. She also attended ballet and gymnastics classes. However, the relationship between her parents was strained. Barbara had problems with alcohol, which she had struggled with for a long time. After Rachel turned 10, the situation worsened. The girl recalled that her mother turned into a real drunkard who verbally and physically abused her husband and daughter at every opportunity. She was not shy about swearing and could grab them by the hair or hit them. Several times, the police had to be called because of domestic violence. This first happened in 2002. The police arrived on a call and found 12-year-old Rachel on the street. The girl showed bite marks that her mother had allegedly left. The report noted several wounds on the girl's back that she definitely could not have inflicted on herself. However, Rachel later confessed that she had made up this story and asked not to press charges against her mother. Most likely, she simply did not want Barbara to get in trouble. After such outbursts of aggression, the woman usually apologized to her family for a long time. When Barbara was not drinking, she was a caring mother. Even her ex-husbands described her as a kind and sociable person. But as soon as she touched alcohol, everything changed. All of Barbara's marriages fell apart for the same reasons, because of her drunkenness or because of aggressive behavior due to her difficult character. When Rachel turned 13, her father Bruce got tired of his wife's antics and decided to end the relationship. The man went to Newport Beach, California, to look for work. Barbara chose Tampa, Florida as her new place of residence. A difficult divorce process began, but both did not want to drag it out. To avoid unnecessary disputes, the parents suggested that their daughter choose for herself who she wanted to stay with. For a teenager, this was a real test. After the move, the parents would be in different states, so Rachel would have to make a lot of effort to see the one who would live separately. The choice was not easy, but in the end, the girl decided to move with her mother to Tampa. Her father was to pay alimony. This decision shocked Rachel's friends who knew about Barbara's alcohol problems and her lack of restraint. Even then, many predicted that this story would end badly. Unfortunately, the fears turned out to be not unfounded. The first incidents happened very soon. In 2004, the Tampa police received a call from the house where Barbara and Rachel lived. When the patrol officers arrived, they saw a woman in tears, nervous and trembling. There were injuries on her body, some of which she definitely could not have inflicted on herself. The woman was reluctant to communicate, answering monosyllabically, but from her words it became clear that these injuries were the work of her daughter Rachel. At the time of the police's arrival, the girl had fled the house. One of the officers called her on her cell phone. Rachel immediately answered and admitted that she had quarreled with her mother. Before leaving, they had fought. After that, the girl hung up and no longer answered the calls. As a result, a report was simply drawn up. Barbara refused to press charges against her daughter, so the case was closed. Previous incidents provoked by the mother in a state of alcoholic intoxication ended in a similar way. During that period, Barbara continued to abuse alcohol, and the situation seemed to only get worse. The woman did not work. She and her daughter lived on aid and alimony from Rachel's father, but this money was clearly not enough. By 2005, all of this led to Barbara being unable to pay the rent, and they were evicted. When they were informed about this and given a day to pack, Rachel called her father Bruce in Newport Beach and asked him to shelter her and her mother for a while, until Barbara recovered from her latest binge and got back on her feet. Bruce doubted that renewing a relationship with his ex-wife was a good idea, but there was no other way out. Rachel skillfully convinced him, saying that if he could not shelter them both, they would be forced to look for other housing and would not come to him. Apparently, Bruce really wanted his daughter to come, so he agreed to these conditions. Rachel herself later admitted that she understood that without her, her mother would finally slide into a marginal life and would no longer be able to get out. The girl hoped that in this way she would be able to save Barbara. Initially, Barbara was well aware that her ex-husband would be against her moving in, so she was very grateful to her daughter for her help. Having received permission from Bruce, mother and daughter packed their things and went to California. Newport Beach remains to this day one of the wealthiest and most prosperous cities in the United States of America. It is located south of Los Angeles and is famous for its beaches and luxury real estate. Bruce had his own apartment here. Usually in such areas, the crime rate is low, and the vast majority of offenses are related to burglaries. Violent assaults are extremely rare. Apparently, criminal elements are simply looking for profit. Unfortunately, with Barbara's arrival, the atmosphere in the house clearly became tense, which greatly upset Bruce. Despite the fact that the ex-spouses lived in separate rooms, they almost immediately began to quarrel. For Rachel, this move was a great opportunity to get acquainted with the secular life of an elite area of America. In any case, she and her mother focused on work, dreaming of achieving success in cinema and becoming famous. Barbara even took the first steps towards her dream. She got a job as an assistant on a film set, actively attended auditions and made new acquaintances. Everything was going on as usual until May 2006, when 17-year-old Rachel met a young man at a party. It was 21-year-old Ian Allen, who was described as a quiet surfer from the country, an athletic guy from a good family, good-natured and hardworking. At that time, he worked full-time, provided for himself, and was focused on his career and starting a family. Romantic feelings immediately arose between the young people, and soon Rachel introduced Ian to her family. At first, the 4-year age difference greatly alarmed Barbara and Bruce, but upon getting to know him better, they saw that their daughter had chosen a worthy guy. Bruce treated him well and hoped that Rachel would settle down with this decent young man. However, Barbara quickly began to have fits of jealousy. It seemed as if she was offended by Ian because he was taking up all of Rachel's free time, and now the girl was paying almost no attention to her mother. In addition, a big blow for Barbara was the change in her daughter's priorities. Rachel focused on her relationship with her boyfriend and pushed her Hollywood dreams into the background. Before that, she and her mother had a common goal: to become actresses and achieve success in cinema. This seemed especially appropriate here in California. Now it became obvious that the girl had lost interest in work, and her hormones had completely clouded her mind. Barbara continued to move towards her dream. She even managed to get a small role in the TV series, CSI, Crime Scene Investigation, where she appeared in one of the episodes as a minor character. Now the woman was waiting for new roles and was afraid that her family dreams of popularity would go to ashes. Given the age difference between the lovers, Rachel demanded official permission from her parents that they did not mind her relationship with Ian. However, she was good at manipulating her mother and father and giving them ultimatums. Probably, this is how the girl forced them to sign this document. From that moment on, the couple could date calmly. The high school girl always had this permission with her so that her boyfriend would not have any problems. The paper completely protected him from any accusations of corrupting a minor, which he was subject to. According to the law, Rachel managed to get very favorable conditions for herself in this agreement. The only restriction was the curfew set at 1 o'clock in the morning. But, as practice has shown, even this turned out to be too serious a restriction for a rebellious teenager. On August 31, 2006, Rachel accidentally fell asleep at her boyfriend's house and missed her curfew. Barbara was furious. She could not get through to her daughter, so she went to Ian's house at the beginning of the second hour of the night. There, the woman began to knock on the door of the guy's family, threw a real tantrum, shouted and woke everyone up. She dragged Rachel out of the house by force and forbade her to see Ian. This came as a shock to the lovers, but for a while the couple decided to obey. 10 days after this conflict, an entry appeared in the girl's diary that her relationship with her mother had deteriorated to an all-time low. She openly called Barbara a psychopath and wrote that she heard threats against her every day. Rachel regretted that she had not left her mother then in Tampa and had not gone to her father alone. Now the girl hoped that Barbara would calm down and everything would be as before, but it did not get better. On September 13, 2006, a yacht sailed into Newport Harbor. Almost immediately, the captain noticed something suspicious in the water and became interested. At first it was tightly sealed, and the yachtsman even thought it looked like a coffin. But he dismissed these gloomy thoughts. When the man retrieved the suspicious object, it indeed turned out to be the body of a woman, wrapped in a bloody sheet. He immediately reported this horrific find to the Coast Guard. When police officers arrived at the scene, they counted 52 stab wounds on the victim's body, inflicted on the face, neck, upper body and back. The most alarming was the knife sticking out of the eye. Along with the body, another bloody knife of a smaller size was wrapped in the same sheet, on which there were even particles of the victim's skin. A third knife was simply lying in the box. All of them were ordinary kitchen utensils from the same set. The body was sent for an autopsy. The forensic expert found that out of the dozens of stab wounds, 2 were fatal. They had cut the jugular vein and carotid artery. Each of these injuries would have killed the victim within minutes, and without immediate medical attention, the chances of survival were 0. According to the expert's conclusion, the murder occurred on the evening of September 12, less than a day before the yacht owner's call. But the victim could not be identified until the forensic expert discovered breast implants. Each of them was assigned a serial number at the factory, thanks to which they could be used similarly to dental records. This is how the police found out that the deceased was Barbara Maliniks. Checking the implant numbers also made it possible to find out the victim's address. Detectives went to the house where she lived with her daughter and ex-husband. When investigators arrived at the family's residence, there was no one in the house. They began to inspect the area. Soon Bruce drove up to the house. The man said that he had been on a business trip 2 hours drive from home for several days and had returned less than an hour ago. According to him, he did not find his daughter or ex-wife at home. Upon returning, Bruce went to the store for groceries and had not yet had time to call them. He confirmed that the cell phones of both were silent, which seemed strange to him, but he did not attach much importance to this, assuming that they were all busy with their own affairs and would return later. In a conversation with detectives, Bruce said that his relationship with Barbara was not easy. Despite the divorce, they lived together again at the request of their daughter. The atmosphere in the house was quite tense, including because of Rachel's teenage years and her relationship with a guy, which worried her parents. Bruce admitted that the main reason for the divorce was his wife's alcohol addiction and her violent behavior when drunk. In addition, he reported that Barbara periodically used illegal substances, which only worsened her inadequate actions. The man immediately got on the list of the main suspects, because he could have had a motive. Barbara herself could easily have provoked the circumstances for an attack. The large number of wounds inflicted indicated a premeditated murder with particular cruelty. The perpetrator clearly felt hatred for his victim. With a high probability, the killer had to be sought among the closest circle of the deceased. Investigators immediately noticed that Bruce was not too upset by the news of Barbara's death. He was either skillfully hiding his true feelings, or indeed felt more sympathy for her problems than anything negative. The man cooperated with the investigation and allowed the apartment to be inspected. During a search of the victim's bedroom, a small imprint was found on the wall, similar to a smeared trace of a bloody hand. In the kitchen bucket, a sponge was found with suspicious dark stains and a latex glove. Obviously, someone had selectively cleaned up the hallway. On the table was a set of knives, which were missing several items. Outwardly, they were identical to those found in the box with the victim's body. Given all these facts, suspicions about Bruce increased. Police detained the man and took him to the station for questioning. However, he immediately provided an alibi that was easily verified. Bruce really was out of town, several hundred kilometers from the crime scene. This was confirmed by records from the motel and the testimony of colleagues. At the time of the murder, he was working with a regular client. The deceased's ex-husband was released after being questioned in detail about the circumstances of the last months of Barbara's life. Despite her quarrelsome character, Bruce did not know anyone who could become her mortal enemy, capable of such a brutal murder. Considering that the family lived together and Rachel had disappeared, the police now wanted to talk to the daughter. When inspecting the family's home, no signs of a break-in were found. Despite this, there were serious fears that Rachel, who had disappeared from all radar, could be in danger. It was impossible to contact the girl, she ignored calls from relatives and the police. There were also no ransom demands. According to the neighbors, the last activity in the apartment was noticed a few days ago. Then the house was empty until the arrival of Bruce and the police. Detectives learned about Rachel's relationship with an older boyfriend. In addition, Bruce told about the problems that arose between Barbara and the young couple, in particular about the latest incident, when the woman took her daughter from the guy's house and forbade her to meet with Ian Allen. Thus, the lovers could have wanted to take revenge on Barbara, who was interfering with their relationship. The police went to Ian's house to talk to him and find out where Rachel was. Suspicions about the couple began to be confirmed. Ian had also disappeared. His parents reported that they last saw their son a few days ago. Since then, they have not been able to get through to him. Relatives were very worried and were already going to go to the police themselves to report the disappearance. They were caught in a car in the driveway, just as they were about to go to the station. Ian's parents allowed the police to inspect the guy's room. Law enforcement officers immediately took his laptop for forensic examination. As it turned out, shortly before his disappearance, Ian had planned a route to Tampa, Florida. His car was not near the house, so the car was immediately put on the wanted list, also distributing a description of the appearance of the young man and his girlfriend Rachel. It seemed that the couple was involved in the crime and was now on the run. The authorities began tracking the activity of the young people's bank cards. In less than a day, a payment at a gas station in Louisiana was recorded. Already on September 15, 2006, one of the officers noticed Ian's car on the road. It was stopped, and the guy surrendered without resistance. Interestingly, as soon as the car was stopped, Rachel ran out of the car and ran to the officers, claiming that she had been kidnapped and was being held against her will. Although it sounded implausible, the girl was not arrested, but was taken to the hospital. Ian was taken to the police station. Medics confirmed that Rachel had no signs of abuse or forcible detention. It seemed that she was in the car voluntarily, without any coercion. In addition, during a second conversation with law enforcement officers, suspicious flaws and contradictions were noticed in her story. After a medical examination, the girl was also arrested and taken to the station. According to Rachel, on the night of September 13, 2006, she woke up from her mother's screams. The girl ran out of bed and ran to Barbara's bedroom, where she saw her boyfriend stabbing the woman to death. As soon as he noticed Rachel, he punched her in the face. The girl fell and lost consciousness. She came to her senses already in a hotel room, where Ian had brought her. The guy kept Rachel there for several days, and then they began to move towards the state border in order to escape. The girl insisted that she had been kidnapped, but the police quickly found evidence that she was lying. At least, there were no traces of a fist blow on her face, which she had talked about. But Rachel's DNA samples were found on latex gloves, a sponge that was found in a box with the body, in Barbara's bedroom, and even on the tape that sealed the box with the corpse. The girl at least helped to hide traces of the crime. The criminals carefully cleaned the knives, so no fingerprints were left on the handles. Because of this, it was possible to restore the sequence of events only from the words of the killer or killers. When checking the correspondence of the young people, it was possible to find out that Rachel had been telling her boyfriend for a long time that her mother was going to kill her, that she heard threats against her every day and was simply afraid for her life. The girl's messages sent on the night of the murder turned out to be especially important. She wrote to Ian that there was another conflict with her mother and it was time to put an end to it. What exactly she meant remained a mystery. Rachel herself insisted that they were discussing running away to another state. However, the context seemed much gloomier. The police reviewed the CCTV footage at the gas station visited by the runaway couple before their arrest. The footage showed Rachel walking calmly next to the guy. She was clearly not being held captive and showed no signs of fear. Detectives decided to talk to Ian again, who had so far denied all charges. Finally, the guy started talking and confessed to committing a brutal crime. According to him, Barbara greatly interfered with his relationship with Rachel. There was even a threat that the woman would accuse him of corrupting a minor. Ian was afraid of losing his job, his girlfriend, his freedom. The crazy alcoholic could ruin his life, and he could not allow that. So the young lovers decided that the only way to solve the problem was to kill Barbara. They planned everything together. Rachel was supposed to watch and choose the perfect moment when her mother would be most vulnerable. Thanks to the girl, Ian found out that Bruce was going on a business trip. At night, the guy broke into the house, the doors of which Rachel left unlocked. When Barbara fell asleep, the young man took several knives from the kitchen and then attacked the woman in the bedroom. The first blow hit the eye. The young man thought that it would instantly kill the victim, but he was wrong. He could not pull the knife out of the eye socket, and Barbara, instead of dying, screamed loudly and began to resist. The guy began to strike blow after blow with another knife, because he was frightened and just wanted to make the woman shut up as soon as possible. Ian took all the blame on himself, stating that Rachel only watched the process, and then helped to clean the room and get rid of the body. The story seemed quite convincing, but there was one flaw in it. The guy mentioned only 2 knives, although the police found 3. Investigators believed that the victim's daughter also took an active part in the reprisal and used the 3rd knife. After the murder, the couple wrapped the body, along with the instruments of the crime, in a sheet, hid it in a large TV box, and took it out of the house, and then threw it into the water. Bruce Maliniks' neighbor confirmed that on that fateful night, he heard loud sounds from the Maliniks' apartment. He saw 2 young people, a guy and a girl, carrying a large box at midnight. This seemed strange to him, especially given that half an hour before that, he had heard a woman's screams. Now it became clear that in this way they got rid of the body, trying to attract as little attention as possible. Having thrown away Barbara's remains, the young people returned home. Rachel cleaned up the blood in her mother's bedroom, while her boyfriend took the mattress and other items to burn them away from the crime scene. At the same time, the girl wrote love messages to Ian, clearly not upset by her mother's death. Investigators were convinced that Rachel actively participated in the crime, because her behavior was too calm. She did not even try to call for help, but on the contrary, urged the guy to finish what he started. This contradicted Ian's words, who described Rachel during the murder as petrified with horror and not involved in the reprisal. In addition, a neighbor said that he saw the young man carrying a large number of black garbage bags out of the house after they had already got rid of the box. The guy confessed that he went with these bags to work and asked his boss for permission to use the company's dumpster. Thanks to this, the bags were found. Inside, personal belongings of the murdered woman were found, which the couple wanted to get rid of. On June 7, 2008, the trial of Rachel began. By that time, her version of events had changed several times. Now the accused admitted that she had lied about the kidnapping, she had gone with the guy voluntarily. At the trial, she adhered to a version more similar to Ian's words. Rachel claimed that she was frightened and became an accomplice not of her own free will, but out of fear. However, it looked more like an attempt to stick to a common legend, from which she had deviated at first. The girl continued to insist that she did not participate in the murder, but only out of fear cleaned up the traces of the crime and helped get rid of the body by packing it in a box. The lawyer failed to convince the court of her non-involvement. The jury found Rachel guilty of killing her mother and sentenced her to 25 years in prison. 2 months later, the trial of Ian Allen took place. When the young man found out that Rachel was putting all the blame on him and had made up a story about the kidnapping, he stopped protecting her. In a fit of anger, Ian said that the girl had been the ideological mastermind of the crime from the very beginning. But now it was too late. The prosecution convincingly proved that he had cold-bloodedly stabbed a defenseless woman in a fit of hatred. Ian was also found guilty and sentenced to the same punishment, 25 years in prison. Despite the guy's words, even now many people support Rachel and consider her innocent. In particular, her brother, grandmother and grandfather are convinced that she became a victim of circumstances. On October 14, 2022, Rachel was released early from prison for good behavior. She went to her father in Newport Beach, California, where she still lives. Ian Allen is still serving his sentence in the state prison. He does not maintain contact with Rachel, their relationship was interrupted in the early stages of imprisonment. The consequences of wanting to preserve a relationship at all costs can be unpredictable and shocking. The desire to keep a partner close sometimes clouds judgment, pushing people to resort to extremely radical and reckless actions. In the small American town of Morgantown, Kentucky, with a population of just 2,500, a horrific event shook the entire community. On April 12, 2011, 30-year-old Katie Coy, a resident of this cozy little place, unexpectedly went into labor while driving her car. The woman was forced to pull over to the side of the road near her friend's house and urgently give birth right in the vehicle. In a panic, she called her friend Shelley Lindsay, begging for help. When Shelley ran up to the car, she saw Katie in the back seat, covered in blood, with a newborn baby in her arms. But the joy of motherhood was overshadowed by worry, the infant was barely breathing. Without wasting a second, Shelley called an ambulance and got behind the wheel to get to the medical center as quickly as possible. Katie managed to name her son Caden, but doctors immediately took the child to the intensive care unit. The boy was in a state of cold shock due to hypothermia and breathing problems. His life was hanging by a thread. However, it wasn't just the newborn's condition that worried the medical staff. After assessing Katie's physical state, they doubted the truthfulness of her story. A visual examination and ultrasound showed that the woman had not actually given birth. Despite Katie's insistence that it was her child, the doctors understood that something was wrong here. Instead of joyful relatives, police officers appeared at Katie's hospital room to clarify the situation. Law enforcement also visited the home where Katie's children from a previous marriage lived with their grandmother. A conversation with 11-year-old Brianna, the eldest daughter, and the grandmother brought unexpected results. The family was surprised by the baby's birth, as they doubted Katie's pregnancy altogether. They only remembered that the woman was supposed to meet with a pregnant friend whose name they did not know. The situation was becoming increasingly suspicious. Detectives, having gained access to Katie's social media page, found her friend there, 21-year-old pregnant Jamie Stice. Attempts to contact the girl proved futile. To avoid hasty conclusions, the police turned to Jamie's mother. The woman, alarmed by her daughter's disappearance, said that Jamie was in the final months of pregnancy and no one could reach her since 9:30 that morning. The girl's mother already wanted to report the disappearance herself but understood that the police were unlikely to start an active search so quickly. Reconstructing the chronology of events, the detectives decided to talk to Katie again, who continued to insist that she gave birth to the child herself. The woman said that she woke up early, drove her husband Shannon to work around 4:30, and then at 10 a.m. went to meet her friend Jamie. Allegedly, Katie managed to get to her, and on the way back felt contractions when she stopped for a snack in the restaurant parking lot. She had to urgently go to the nearest friend, as she would not have made it to the hospital. Katie's friend, Shelley, confirmed to the police that after the call, she ran out into the street and saw her friend in the back seat of the car, bloody, without pants, with a newborn in her arms. The placenta was also in the vehicle. Shelley, assessing the critical condition of the baby, immediately got behind the wheel to get to the hospital. She attributed the remains of grass and dirt on the child to a possible fall on the car floor. Saving the boy's life was more important than figuring out the details. Both women's stories generally matched, except for one fact: Katie claimed that Shelley helped deliver the baby, while Shelley denied it. Everything happened in chaos. The woman in labor was screaming, the child was barely breathing, doctors were rushing to save the newborn. But the police had serious doubts about this whole story. Katie was taken to the station for questioning. A medical examination at that time confirmed that the woman had not given birth. Katie, trying to confirm her new version of events, even showed detectives messages allegedly from the missing Jamie. In them, the girl asked to be picked up from the Social Security office, but Katie refused, explaining it by her own labor. The suspect attributed the difference in testimony to a stressful state and the extraordinary situation. But when investigators expressed doubts about the truthfulness of her words, the story changed dramatically again. This time, Katie stated that she did pick up Jamie and take her home, but the girl was so exhausted that she immediately fell asleep on the couch. And only after that, Katie herself allegedly began to experience contractions. The woman explained such radical changes in testimony by extraordinary circumstances that caused confusion. To figure out where the truth lies among all these versions, the detectives began to find out how Katie and Jamie met in the first place. The mother of the missing girl said that they had only known each other for a few months, having connected through social media shortly before Jamie was due to give birth. But Katie herself claimed that she had only known the 21-year-old pregnant woman for a couple of weeks and met her through a mutual friend when she was looking for housing assistance. However, she could not even name this mysterious friend. In addition, despite Katie's assurances that the missing girl was 30 weeks pregnant, Jamie was actually already at 36 weeks. So the found baby fully corresponded to the missing woman's pregnancy term, which only heightened suspicions. When Katie was informed that Jamie disappeared immediately after meeting with her, around 10:30 a.m., and that the parents still could not contact the girl, the detectives insisted that the suspect help in the search. But at this stage, the investigators doubted that the child was actually born to Katie. Meanwhile, the suspect's husband, Shannon, arrived. He sincerely rejoiced that his wife had finally managed to carry a child and did not understand why she was detained and interrogated. He told the police that Katie had miscarriages in the past, which caused her long-term depression. This pregnancy meant a lot to her. The couple had long dreamed of having children together, and Shannon was convinced that if it didn't work out with Katie, they would have to divorce. Gradually, a grim picture emerged. A strong motive for deception, horrific revelations. A desperate desire to become a mother, it seemed, could push a distraught woman to do anything, even murder. Perhaps Katie faked the pregnancy to keep her husband. Or maybe her friend Shelley, who brought the new mother to the hospital, was also involved in all this. As it turned out, Shelley often visited Katie, listening to stories about the course of the pregnancy. It remained unclear whether the friend guessed about the deception or perhaps even helped commit the crime. However, Shelley herself assured the detectives that she never doubted Katie's words and trusted her completely. Although she later admitted that she was involved in many episodes of this lie. For example, it was she who pretended to be a nurse when, after another appointment with the gynecologist, Katie was informed that she was not pregnant. The suspect understood that this could be the last straw, and her husband would leave her. So she persuaded Shelley to call Shannon, pretend to be a medical worker, and confirm the pregnancy. It remained a mystery whether the friend guessed how far this lie could go. And where did Jamie go? Shelley insisted that she had no idea that Katie was pretending to be pregnant and had conceived something sinister. From the very beginning, she was convinced that everything was serious, so she sincerely rejoiced for her friend. Katie managed to persuade her about the difficulties of pregnancy under various pretexts and convince her to help save the marriage. Until the very end, Shelley hoped that her friend would give birth after all. However, among Katie's inner circle, not everyone was so gullible. Police conversations with other friends of the suspect and her husband's relatives showed that the woman's delicate condition had long caused fierce disputes. In recent months, many tried to expose Katie's deception. Especially the mother-in-law. She repeatedly visited Katie, trying to bring her to clean water, because she suspected that her son was a victim of deception. The mother-in-law was incredibly annoyed by her daughter-in-law's behavior. She shared her thoughts with Shannon and even briefly convinced him. Many details about the strange pregnancy were alarming. For example, the constant postponement of the due date. Wasn't the wait too long? Did Katie herself not know when she would give birth? And the belly, as the vigilant mother-in-law noticed, sometimes decreased, then increased again. Already at the end of 2010, the woman had almost no doubt. Her daughter-in-law was brazenly lying because she was terrified that her husband would leave her. The only question was how far this deception had gone. Despite all the warnings from his mother, Shannon hesitated for a long time to believe in his wife's deception. But the mother-in-law was relentless, pointing out Katie's obvious lies to her son again and again. Eventually, the man began to demand more convincing proof of pregnancy. Katie had to resort to new tricks to keep her husband. During another visit to the pregnant Jamie, she stole an ultrasound photo. And although this image calmed Shannon for a while, the matter was not limited to one argument. The man waited with bated breath for the addition to the family, but his mother was not at all moved by the stolen photo. She tirelessly convinced her son that Katie was lying. And if the truth was revealed, the marriage would be doomed. Shannon was plagued by doubts. To dispel them, he began to demand additional confirmations from Katie. The cunning woman prepared thoroughly. Once, she even managed to show her husband a video where the heartbeat of the unborn child could allegedly be heard. In fact, Katie just downloaded the recording from the internet. Shannon was repeatedly misled. His mother was extremely disappointed by her son's gullibility but had no idea what this persistent lie could lead to. And it seemed that she did not know Katie herself at all. However, it became clear, the closer to the probable birth, the more difficult it was for Katie to pretend to be pregnant. The nurse friend, the stolen ultrasound photo, and the video from the internet no longer worked so convincingly. And when Jamie disappeared, Katie used the collected evidence to convince the police and doctors that it was she who gave birth to the found boy. A dreadful picture gradually emerged in the minds of the investigators. Where did the baby really come from, and why can't anyone find his real mother? Katie was immediately detained and interrogated at the police station. However, the woman stubbornly did not confess. Her testimony was extremely confused and contradictory. The story changed every time the police voiced new facts. The investigators had no doubt that the suspect was lying. So, to bring her to clean water, they decided to resort to tricks. To begin with, They left the alarmed Katie alone in the interrogation room. It was interesting to see what she would do without supervision. The technique worked, although not quite as expected. The woman suddenly took out her mobile phone and called an unknown number, pretending to talk to Jamie. Upon returning, the detectives heard a new story, but Katie still could not explain where the missing girl was. The number that the suspect called was checked immediately. The call was not to Jamie at all. So the investigators openly stated, there is no doubt that the child Katie brought to the hospital was actually born to the missing girl. DNA examination confirmed everything. The detectives were bluffing. In fact, the analysis was still ongoing. But Katie wavered. Discrepancies began to appear again in her testimony. Unfortunately, the woman still did not admit what happened to her pregnant friend. Then she was told, witnesses were found who saw the missing Jamie get into Katie's car that morning. But no one could confirm that the girl returned. This directly contradicted the suspect's words. The police tried to find out where Katie actually took Jamie and why she was left with her child in her arms. Doctors insisted, the baby's breathing problems and hypothermia were not accidental. The boy was born less than an hour before arriving at the medical center. His lungs were still filled with fluid. Katie simply got confused in that situation. She did not know how to help the child. So the baby's condition worsened. When the investigators voiced all these facts, the woman gave another version. Allegedly, about 9 months before those events, while visiting the hospital after another miscarriage, she met a stranger near the clinic who introduced herself as Ashley. The woman offered to buy Jamie's unborn child for $550. They say they just need to wait until the boy is born. According to Katie, she immediately agreed and gave the money, hoping to save her marriage in this way. So for all the following months, she pretended to be pregnant to make the deception convincing. And on that fateful day, she simply took the child from Jamie and left, without causing any harm to her friend. The story sounded absolutely absurd. Who is Ashley, and where could she get a baby? And if Jamie gave birth to a boy, then where did the woman in labor herself go? How could the mysterious Ashley know about the pregnancy 9 months before the birth and that it would be a son? And Katie could not provide any information about this woman, no numbers, no addresses, not even a description of her appearance. It seems that she simply made up the whole story on the spot. At least this version was completely shattered. Eventually, the suspect confessed, there was no Ashley or agreement to buy the child. But she stubbornly remained silent about Jamie's fate. She only repeated over and over that she picked up the girl in the morning from home, and then she allegedly just disappeared, giving the baby away. Where and under what circumstances someone else's child ended up in Katie's hands, the woman evaded explaining. By that time, the DNA examination results had already arrived. They fully confirmed, the boy was indeed the missing Jamie's son. Investigators began to take a closer look at the suspect's identity and quite quickly came across alarming details. In particular, from Katie's former lover. The man talked about repeated manifestations of her shocking behavior. The woman scared him so much that he did not want to have any contact with her. He described her as a cruel, manipulative, and unpredictable person capable of the most terrible acts for the sake of her own pleasure or benefit. Long before all these events, Katie confessed to him that she could commit murder. So, upon hearing about the ex's detention, the man was not at all surprised. He was convinced that she was capable of any villainy. The former was convinced, Katie is absolutely indifferent to the suffering of others, she is able to inflict pain on anyone. Soon it turned out that the suspect had long been known to law enforcement. Detectives found a police report where Katie was accused of stalking a fellow teacher with whom she worked together. The women often crossed paths at school, and Katie's behavior was so alarming that the frightened colleague began to keep a diary, describing in detail all the strange incidents. The most chilling incidents occurred when the teacher was left alone in the classroom. Katie could just freeze in the doorway and silently watch her. Interestingly, it was during the same period when her colleague was pregnant that Katie also began to tell everyone about her upcoming pregnancy. And after that teacher had a miscarriage, Katie herself suddenly got pregnant. A coincidence? Or maybe if the colleague had been luckier, she would have become the victim instead of Jamie. Investigators made every effort to obtain a confession from the detainee. They were not going to let her go, but strong evidence was needed to bring charges. Fortunately, such evidence existed. And Katie had no idea about it yet. The woman stubbornly stuck to her version, but the detectives had almost no doubt that Jamie was no longer alive. And here's why. When Katie, together with her friend, brought the child to the hospital, the doctors were given not only the baby. Along with him were the placenta and some other female organs. The find shocked the doctors. During normal childbirth, this simply cannot happen, because these organs should remain in the woman's body. The medics immediately contacted the police. After examining the organs, the experts came to a chilling conclusion: most likely, someone performed an improvised cesarean section operation without having sufficient knowledge of medicine and anatomy. Because of this, they simply cut out everything they saw from the body in order to imitate childbirth. Without these vital organs, the woman would simply bleed to death. It is unlikely that Jamie had any chance of salvation. In addition, cuts were found on the organs, very similar to stab wounds. Even the baby itself had some wounds. Everything pointed to a cesarean section performed carelessly, in a hurry, in extremely negligent and even hostile conditions. In conversations with doctors, detectives found out, in order to save the life of a newborn in case of the mother's death, one must act swiftly. After the woman in labor's heart stops, there are no more than 5 minutes. Katie obviously knew about this, so she was in a hurry. Because of this, she made many gross mistakes that almost cost the child's life. The medics who provided assistance to the boy still cannot recover from the shock of how carelessly and brutally the operation was performed. They had almost no doubt, the woman in labor died in terrible agony, literally gutted. After several hours of interrogation, Katie began to slowly give up her position. However, she did not confess to the murder but began to pretend to be insane. Even when the detective went on the offensive, the woman was distracted and insisted that her place was in a psychiatric hospital, not in prison. The police suspected, this is how Katie was preparing ways to retreat in order to avoid punishment due to insanity. So the investigators changed tactics. They put aside the pressure and tried to calm the likely killer, insisting that the so-called bad things could have happened accidentally. The main thing was to find out at least something. Katie remained the last person who saw Jamie alive. All the evidence screamed about her guilt, but the investigators feared that the detainee would still manage to slip away. The woman stubbornly stuck to her testimony. The cops carefully asked her inner circle about her, but found no reliable confirmation of her stories. However, some details still shed light on the horrific events. And all of them testified against Katie. The detainees' children added interesting details. They said that about 2 weeks before the birth, their mother took them to a flea market. There, Katie carefully chose a stun gun, eventually settling on the most powerful model. The seller mentioned that upon contact with the skin, this thing is capable of knocking down even an adult man. It seems that Katie decided to test the purchase right away. At the market, she approached a strongly built stranger and began waving the shocker around. And when the man did not even budge, Katie, without thinking twice, applied the electrodes to his leg. The guy did fall, and the woman laughed and walked away, clearly satisfied with the investment. After several hours of persistent questioning, Katie finally began to give out details of her horrific plan. According to her, when the baby was born, she first wanted to imitate her own birth as realistically as possible. She even planned to place the placenta and the fetus inside herself. But she quickly realized that it was too complicated. She had to improvise right in the car. Once at her friend's house, Katie sat in the back seat, placing Jamie's cut-out organs under herself. She held the baby in her arms, creating a chilling illusion of a newborn child. But Katie still did not reveal where Jamie herself was. The detainee's propensity for violence was confirmed by all her loved ones. Even her own mother was afraid of her daughter, realizing what atrocities she was capable of. The woman had long taken Katie's children from her first marriage and raised them herself. Shannon's relatives were shocked by Katie's periodic antics, begging the man to divorce as soon as possible. After a partial confession, the suspect began to develop the theme of multiple personalities. Now she claimed that it was not she who came to her friend with the baby at all, but some Lindsay, one of her alter egos. It was Lindsay that Katie tried to shift the responsibility for everything that happened to Jamie onto. However, she avoided the details. The woman repeated again and again that her place was in a psychiatric hospital, not behind bars. She said that when a transition between personalities occurs, she does not control herself and does not remember anything. Katie even told how she once got into a car, and when she came to her senses, she was already in another area of the city and had no idea how she got there. Of course, the detectives did not believe a single word. Katie's schizophrenia was too convenient to be true. But it turned out that the likely kidnapper discussed her plans with loved ones even before the crime. And she even asked her children to help her kidnap someone else's baby. True, when everyone refused, she tried to pass off this idea as a failed joke. Even her own mother told how her daughter persuaded her to join the murder, but the woman categorically rejected this vile offer. Katie's relatives and acquaintances unanimously denied her attempts to pretend to be a split personality. Even Shannon noted that before this incident, his wife had no signs of mental illness. But the other self that Katie demonstrated during the interrogations behaved surprisingly confidently. She insisted that it would not be possible to prove her guilt, that Jamie was alive and well. And this despite the fact that the girl definitely could not survive with such terrible wounds. Katie's fervor subsided a bit when she was told that she was suspected of premeditated murder. Only after the arrest did the woman finally begin to cooperate with the investigation. She even agreed to show the place where she left Jamie. Only then did the detectives realize the full scale of the evil committed. It turned out that the friendship between the killer and her victim was nothing more than a myth. From the very beginning, Katie was stalking Jamie, hunting for her unborn baby. She lured the girl to meetings, showered her with gifts, promised to help with employment after giving birth. The scene of the massacre was a forest thicket, where Katie led the investigators. It was there that they found the mutilated body of the missing woman. Slashed, gutted, with traces of a stun gun on the neck. The killer immobilized her victim with this device. By the way, Katie purchased the shocker at that very ill-fated flea market, where she took her children with her. Just a couple of weeks before the massacre of Jamie. When the body was examined by forensic experts, it became clear, the girl died from numerous stab wounds and blood loss. Katie first paralyzed her with an electric shock, then slit her throat and wrists. And only after that, she simply ripped open the pregnant woman's stomach right in the forest, taking the child out of there. That's why the baby was smeared with grass and blood when Katie rushed from the birth to her friend. The killer did not even bother with proper preparation for her chilling operation. As she admitted during the interrogation, she only flipped through the topic on the internet once, read what and how to cut. And she decided that this knowledge was quite enough for success. Of course, for a person who has nothing to do with medicine, such preparation was by no means sufficient. 34-year-old Katie was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping an adult and a baby. The defendant appeared in court and pleaded guilty to the murder of 21-year-old Jamie Stice and the abduction of her child. The baby, which Katie simply cut out of the victim's womb, was miraculously saved. Later, the boy was named Isaiah Reynolds, leaving him the second surname Stice after his mother. The child stayed with his father. On the day of the trial, Katie passed notes to her children, where she verbosely described her crime. However, admitting to the murder, the woman clearly added a lot of lies to her story. The jury had no doubt. Katie was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to early release. The couple's shared children were sent to a foster family. And Shannon, having recovered from the nightmare marriage, soon married again, this time to a normal woman. Later, Katie's children gave several interviews in which they said that on the day of the terrible murder, their mother behaved absolutely as usual. Although, perhaps, she was a little nervous, but she was not at all worried about how the birth would go. During the trial, Shannon could not hold back his tears. The man admitted that the divorce from Katie was by no means because of her new child. He was just happy that this woman would no longer be able to harm anyone. At the same time, Shannon terribly regretted Jamie's death. And he reproached himself for not going to the police immediately after Katie's confession about her desire to kill someone. Perhaps then he could have saved both the mother and the child. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.